Thank you so much for having me tonight. I am excited to talk to you about Islam and modernity. I've met a lot of you, but I still feel I don't know a lot about my audience. So I want to start out, and if I may come away from the microphone, if you can hear me in the back, I want to get a sense of where you are coming from in terms of these topics. I'll be talking about Islam and modernity from a social scientist point of view, looking at some of the foremost theorists of modernity. And I'm also going to talk about, as I'm an anthropologist, I'm not just a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist, I'm going to look at modernity in very specific contexts. And that context is Central Asia, where I do my research. So first of all, maybe we'll start with the Central Asia part. Who could point to Bishkek on a map? I'm just getting pressed. Who knows the capital of Uzbekistan? Tashkent. Who can tell me the significance of 1917?
Like the Soviet Revolution.
Soviet Revolution, thank you very much. I gotta stump you on one, let's see.
Who can read it?
Well, you have
Who can read this?
SMS Islam.
Great. And what about this one?
Oh, no.
Namaz? Namaz, the Persian word for prayer. Okay, that gives me a sense. So some of you come with a significant amount of background, some background in Central Asia. It's not a blank spot on the map as it was to me when I first went there. I went to school when it was the Soviet Union, so I never learned much about Central Asia growing up. So, modernity. Now this topic was given to me and I must admit, I was with a mixture of joy and consternation because modernity is one of those incredibly abstract subjects that everyone has a different opinion about. So just brainstorm, what are the first words that come to your mind when I say the word modernity? It doesn't have to be scholarly words. It can be if you've just been reading something about modernity.
I would say here, now.
Now, okay. So it's something about the contemporary era.
My students have just finished reading Anthony Giddens, The Consequences of Modernity, but
Okay.
they're being shy. Go ahead, Rod.
Words that you associate with modernity.
Industrialization.
What?
Industrial revolution.
Okay, wonderful. So there's some
State.
industrialization.
Central state.
Central states. Okay.
Globalization.
Globalization.
Secularism.
Secularization, yes. Of course, it doesn't make it much easier when we get into something like secularization. So I view this and many things to be part of this notion of modernity. Westernization, of course, that is oftentimes closely thought of next to capitalism. Industrialization, science and technology, globalization, these are all words we have some kind of intuitive sense that these are what modernity is referring to. The rise of the nation state, which I'll talk about in terms of Central Asia. Rationalization. Democratization, secularization, individualism. There's something about modernity and the importance of the individual, which we'll get to. I'm going to focus today on a couple of these. Certainly the rise of the nation state, but particularly I want to talk about secularization, globalization, and rationalization as a good starting place for talking about modernity. And so I'm actually kind of putting on not just my researcher cap, but I'm also here with the goal to give you a lesson, if you will, in the social theory of modernity. Starting with these topics, I've had to narrow it a little bit. So I'm actually going to take these 5, and I'm not going to belabor them too much, but I want to just touch on each of them. Rationalization is an important one because one of the scholars that I think is most commonly invoked when we talk about modernity is Max Weber. Max Weber is the preeminent theorist of modernity, particularly his notion of the inevitability of rationalization. So one place to start when talking about modernity is an era in which rationalization becomes central to life and change and all kinds of practice. But what does rationalization even mean? Give order to what was disordered. Human mind seems to have a desire to give order to whatever was disordered. Applying scientific knowledge whenever possible is part of rationalization. Depersonalizing decisions. When I make a decision, I'm not going to think about who my kin are. I'm not going to think about what my interests are. I'm going to think of the goals of whatever institution I'm working for, whatever bureaucracy I'm working for. Bureaucracy was another thing that Weber often talked about in relation to rationalization. Privileging goal-oriented activity, efficiency, specialization, these are all part of Weber's understanding of rationalization, and therefore his understanding of modernity. Now, what does that say about religion? Ultimately, we're going to be speaking about Islam, but certainly this is something that has importance for many other religious and spiritual traditions. What happens when an ethos of rationalization meets various spiritual traditions? Weber believed that one of the things that happens is you have increased theological coherence. So rather than different authorities saying different things all across the geography, there are certain ideas that become more important. There are certain ideas that other ideas need to be measured against and change if they don't necessarily agree with those kinds of ideas. You have more sophisticated theodicies. Theodicy is just the philosophy of evil, or how to deal with evil. Particularly, you have theodicies that deal with salvation, notions of salvation. This is part of rationalization. How to deal with evil becomes a central problem, particularly if we're going to be rational. What is rational about evil? What is rational about who gets punished and who doesn't? So religions who become rationalized have to deal with that.
Can you sort of define that word? Because I always thought anything starting with theo had God in it. So how does this world evolve and evolve evil?
Right. Well, the question, a theodicy answers the question: how can we have a benevolent, all-powerful God and evil? So trying to make sense of that from a philosophical standpoint. And for a rational theology, that becomes particularly difficult. How do you make it all coherent? A focus on the individual. So religion becomes more about what I experience when I go out into the woods and commune with the higher being, what I experience, my experience of morality, my need to meet my emotional needs. All of these things now must become part of religion. All right, so that gets us started with modernity as at heart, at base, a process of rationalization, of order, of coherence, of individualism, of goal-orientedness, efficiency. Now let's talk a little bit about secularization. So let's very quickly get rid of this notion of secularization as the disappearance or decline of religion. Yes, that was a theory that lots of theorists believed for a while, but it pretty quickly was revealed that no, actually, in the modern era, religion hasn't gone away, but part of this process of rationalization that Weber is talking about has produced, religion now has a different way of occupying societies. And that is what I'm going to refer to when I talk about secularization. And I hope all of you, when you think of that word secularization, can also have that kind of association. First of all, when we talk about secularization, I think one of the most acceptable or maybe persuasive accounts of secularization is that it involves differentiation. Now, this is where that rationalization comes in. Differentiation of different parts of society and separating different parts of society, where, let's say, spiritual ideas might have been part of our judicial systems and our market behaviors. Now we're going to compartmentalize. So we're differentiating. And again, the privatization of religion. Religion is being part of differentiation, is religion is being pulled out of the public sphere. and it's in the individual person. So this is particularly seen in the work of Peter Berger and Jose Casanova. They have some very interesting accounts, sociologists, who've described these processes, particularly in American society, really with the goal of overturning this assumption that secularization means religion's going away. It's not going away, which is probably a good thing. Casanova believes it's very much a good thing. Religions need to be part of society, but they are part of society in new ways. So I think I already explored differentiation. So maybe one way to think about this, because modernity is oftentimes linked to the West and Western mentalities, and this is a problem too for many theorists today. But when we think about this particular genealogy of thought, the people like Peter Berger and Jose Casanova and Weber, they are emerging out of an intellectual tradition which was also emerging out of medieval Christianity and its understanding of reality. So in the medieval Christendom's understanding of reality, you have everything is part of an eternal age, the realm of the divine. And then within that realm, you happen to have maybe our secular historical age, but part of that secular historical age is also infused with religion. So you really don't have a lot of differentiation. Religion is really the ground on which everything else takes place. After rationalization and secularization, differentiation, I love all these long words, you have where this world has, this historical secular world has now replaced the spiritual sense of an all-abiding cosmos. And then you have other kinds of realms of life, with the church, with religion just being one of them. So religion has been differentiated into its own realm. Other things have been differentiated into their own realms. You have this very much kind of a demoting of religion from what used to be all-encompassing to now one little sphere in the broader life of the individual. Now, this is something that I constructed for my students. It's kind of a little over the top, I recognize. The eternal age of God, the historical temporal realm, which includes the church as well, and then this little realm down here for all your secular behavior. You go to the market, living your life in the village, as opposed to the new differentiated moment where everything is now this kind of secular life, and oh yeah, there's a little bit of space for the church down here, and then all the other parts of life elsewhere as well. So this is what we mean by differentiation. Now, by privatization, in a world where religion is given its own small little space, it oftentimes becomes very much confined to the individual. So it becomes a choice that you make. You can go to whichever church that you like. It becomes more about your inner experience of morality. Sometimes it becomes a form of therapy. One of the interesting things about this new place for religion is that actually faith, rather than being the default condition, faith is now something that individuals must strive for. So in that before we had this differentiation, you woke up and you had faith, and you went to bed and you had faith, and it was easy for people of all different kinds of people to have faith. Whereas in maybe one of the characteristics of the modern era is the struggle to have faith. This struggle to have faith as an individual.
It means then that we have a choice, and we have the choice even not to have one.
Exactly, right. And so for many people, actually, the experience of modernity is feeling like you have to strive to have faith. It's even hard to have straight faith, whereas maybe the pre-modern mentality in this theorization is faith is the easy default way to be, and it's hard not to have faith, or it's hard to give up faith. Peter Berger writes, insofar as religion is common, that means public, it lacks reality. It doesn't really have much importance. Yes, religion is in the public sphere, but it really doesn't have any power over anybody or say anything important. And insofar as it is real, that means where it has some kind of power, it lacks commonality. It's only located in the individual. So any religion that's in the public sphere, spiritual messages that are in the public sphere are really not, they don't have that much power or interest. It's what's inside the individual, kind of confined to the private sphere, that might have some power. But again, that's challenging because it's no longer shared. This is the understanding of secularization. There's my quote that I just read. All right, so we did rationalization, we talked about secularization. Globalization is, I think, maybe more fun to think about. The way that modernity is characterized by movement, by exchange, by movement of people, of ideas, of things. Of course, new forms of capitalism can be good or bad depending on where you stand and your position in the class hierarchy. And then new understandings of identity. As people move around, the ways that we construct identity categories by necessity will change. And this has a very large impact on religion, as I will argue, particularly in my field site of Central Asia. So what about the impact of globalization and religion? Now here I'm drawing from Olivier Roy's work on globalized Islam. Now, I'm sure there are many problems that we could identify with this somewhat simplistic understanding of global Islam, but it's worth considering as a statement, as a scholarly statement of some kind of, or an attempt to make a statement about some kind of global situation of a religion, and particularly trying to get some grip on what globalization has done and its impact on Islam. And actually he makes the argument throughout the work that it's also had similar impacts on other religions like Christianity. So Roy makes this distinction between religion, which is something that it's based on localities, it's based on communities in particular landscapes. Membership is, again, not by choice, right? You're born and that's your membership in that community, and as part of this community, you are also part of the religious tradition of the community. Authority is relatively diffuse. Religious authority is relatively diffuse. It could be your neighbor, it could be that Moldo down the street, it could be your parents, your grandparents. Mm-hmm.
How would that be with Roman Catholicism, which I feel is still a very clear center of authority?
Right, he doesn't, he's arguing that the shift to religiosity is more commonly seen in evangelical forms of Christianity. But certainly Roman Catholicism in many locations might very much preserve this notion of a connection with the locale, with the landscape, with shrines and sacred formations. Culture and religion being very much linked. So then in religiosity, which is Roy's understanding of what happens when you add globalization to the mix, you are no longer focused on local spirits, you are now focused on, your perspective has widened to encompass the entire world. And therefore your understanding of the divine has widened. You are now part of a religious community that is not defined by your language or your ethnicity or what valley you grew up in. It's now defined by imaginaries, cross-cultural, cross-national, international imaginaries, being part of communities, a community with people you don't even know, the sense of an imagined community of Benedict Anderson. Membership is not something that you're born into, it's something that must be performed. You must show that you're a member. You must constantly revive and perform your membership. And authority here has shifted a lot. There are clear locations where you can find religious authority. When you have a question about what is correct practice, it's much clearer. You and many, many more people know where to go to get answers to your questions. Now, this is maybe some place where he might simplify a little bit. I think in many religious communities, authority remains pretty diverse. All right, and dealing with culture and religion. So that gives us a sense of how we might think of globalization as a defining term in modernity and its impact on religion. Now I want to talk a little bit about the post-colonial order. This is, I view this as one of the most important keys to understanding the modern era. The place where I do my field work was basically occupied by Russia for 30 or 40 years before it became a part of the Soviet regime. And as such, there was also a kind of colonial relationship set up with Moscow and the Central Asian localities. So this I take to be a very important ingredient. So what would colonialism mean for modernity? Well, colonialism is, I think, defined by things like economic domination, the imposition of nation states where there were none before, the invention of new systems of identity, cultural mixing, but particularly this creation of a notion of modernity. I mean, on one sense, we can sit here and talk about modernity and idealize it as globalization, but underneath it, there is some very problematic way in which modernity seems to conjure up, or modernity has some link with the West. And a number of theorists, particularly one of my favorites, Talal Asad, has called attention to this and has said, you know what, modernity is not just an era. It's not just shifts or changes on a global scale. It's actually a political project. It's a political project that tells people these particular ways of living your life and practicing your religion are preferred and other ways are not. And particularly when we think about this in the context of colonialism, the Western colonial powers have been instrumental in creating these notions of the West as being the referent for modernity. So I want to add that to the mix then, the importance of remembering that many parts of the world were colonized, experienced domination by the Western regions, and that this continues to shape their experience of modernity. And then finally, I'm not going to say much about this now, but just to throw this out to tantalize you a little bit, one of the most interesting developments that I see in the scholarship on modernity is to talk about multiple modernities. And I would be interested to hear what you think. I mean, I love Talal Asad's work on the importance of global structures of domination and hierarchy, but also there's some interesting scholars of transnationalism and globalization that remind us different locales have different ways of thinking and talking about modernity. Even somebody as several decades ago as Clifford Geertz, one of my idols within the field of anthropology, in the 1960s already started to talk about modernity as local, modernity as equal to multiformity. And this idea has been taken up more recently by Robert Hefner and a number of others, a couple people working in my field site, to think about how different ways of thinking about modernity shape the way people think about their future and their goals and their aspirations and their spiritual lives. These are just a couple of porous pluralism, pluralization, radical pluralism. So clearly this notion of multiple modernities wants to invoke a sense of plurality. All right, so now I get to bring you into my fieldwork context. I'm an anthropologist. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I do fieldwork. I do ethnography. I work with communities. I try to live in communities for an extended period of time, learning the language, learning the culture, and seeking the answers to particular questions that people in my field site think are important and that I think might have some theoretical interest. So today I'm going to introduce you to this region, if you don't know about it before, Central Asia, which is a formerly Soviet region, these 5 republics. And I actually did work in, actually I have a laser pointer, let's see how that looks. I did work in Kyrgyzstan. So this region has been part of the Muslim world since almost the beginning of Islam. Arab armies moved into Central Asia by the early 7th century. After that, they were followed by traders and missionaries and Sufi groups, teachers. It was it was quite a rapid change. Some populations were converted a little bit later, but it was definitely very quickly became part of the Muslim world. And actually, centers in Central Asia were very important centers of learning. Bukhara was an important location. Khiva, Samarkand were important centers of Islamic learning and also medical knowledge and mathematics. All kinds of wonderful things were going on there during this era and a little bit later until the Mongols showed up in the 13th century when things kind of went in the other direction. So here's a better map to give you a sense of where I was doing fieldwork kind of over here. And this is modern day Uzbekistan, here's Turkmenistan, Iran is over here. So when I teach about Central Asia, and particularly when I talk about the religious traditions in Central Asia, I try to simplify things a little bit with the recognition that I am simplifying, with a caveat that I am simplifying. So I often tell my students, okay, well, in order to make sense of this very complex spiritual life and which was mixed up with political life in Central Asia, we can start to think about Central Asian Islam as having three traditions. Now, I 100% want to avoid any kind of high, low, literate, illiterate, urban, non-urban kind of divisions that are so common in the Orientalist scholarship. But so what I've tried to do is think about the sociological impact of different parts of spiritual life and the connections, and to put it in some kind of simplified order in order to help my students understand the modern condition better. So my goal is really to give this background so that you can understand what's happening today a little bit better, because history is the key, I think, to understanding the present. So the first important tradition was scholarly Islam. I told you that this was a center of the Muslim world, wonderful scholarship, science was going on here. And so there were many institutions of higher learning. There were beautiful mosques, masjids, and also a very politically powerful group of scholars and judges and other kinds of people who were part of the Islamic establishment.
Funny question.
Sure.
This doesn't show one person as the thing abandoned. Is it no longer functioning? Is this only history?
I believe it does have Friday prayers, but much of Bukhara has become like a museum city, I think it's called. It's mostly tourists who come through there now, unfortunately. But this was the largest mosque in Central Asia for many, many years, until I think one of those authoritarian leaders built a larger one. So formal institutions, schools, mosques, courts, endowments, credentialed clerics. It took 18 years to become credentialed in this system as a recognized cleric or judge. Learning through the study of formal knowledge, young men studied in small maktabs in their village, and then the lucky ones could go to cities and study in the madrasas there. And what was very interesting, particularly when you compare it to the modern era, is the balance of political power. Religion, this is where differentiation comes in. Religion, spiritual leaders were part of many, or they were in charge of many functions that today are only in the hands of the state. So, of course, the whole judicial system was run by the clerics, who were specialists in the legal tradition of the spiritual tradition of the region. Many forms of social welfare. They were all part of the religious establishment. From Adib Khalid, Islam did not reside in certain scriptures. It was embedded in social practices of transmission and interpretation. So a very rich tradition of teaching and scholarship that went on here. This is a madrasa in, I think it's in Samarkand. And all these little rooms would have been where the young men came to study. You had a very vibrant Sufi tradition. Sufism, of course, being the brotherhoods that would form around charismatic teachers. They would teach, whereas in the madrasas you would learn through studying texts from recognized scholars, when you went to your peer and learned from your brotherhood, it was through experience. Oftentimes, these brotherhoods became enshrined in particular locations, in shrines, literally. And they also helped balance the power. These Sufi leaders, because of their charisma, they had a certain amount of power.
Brotherhood.
Yes.
Where are the women?
There's not, that's a great question. There's not a lot of documentation about what women were
But I
doing.
have heard or read about very scholarly women.
There were women. They were teachers, and there is starting to be scholarship. Some of my closest friends and colleagues are working on that. It just has not yet. It hasn't come about yet that we know. That it's been read by a wider public.
So there is a modern deafness or blindness about it, and it's not necessarily in the Middle Ages that these women didn't matter, but the way we see it now. Is that correct?
Well, I will say that women weren't necessarily part of this of a lot of these formal institutions. They tended to have more informal gatherings.
But they were able to do that.
Yes, they were absolutely. They were recognized teachers, and they were critical to passing on the spiritual knowledge. Vernon Schubel writes, the Sufi orders instill experiential access, instilling beliefs and attitudes in an existential rather than cognitive way. And some of the students who've sitting in the class a lot can probably identify with that. Naqshband, some of you may be familiar with the Naqshband Sufi order. It actually has its origins in Central Asia. These are some pictures from the shrine of Bahauddin Naqshband. And finally, you have what I call customary practice, which is much more diverse. Things that were done at funerals, things that were to help you be healthy and wealthy, etc., live long life and be fertile. The sources of authority weren't necessarily the imam or the judge, but possibly parents and people in your community watching what other people did to learn about what you should do. And many of these practices, interestingly enough, were constantly being debated by the scholars, and one generation of scholars would declare them impermissible, the next generation would say, no, this one's okay, that one don't do. So there was a lot of debate about what was okay to do and what was not, particularly in these domestic practices. So just some pictures of, these are more modern grave sites, but it gives you a sense of some practices that people might do that were questionable. So making wishes on trees. This is a shrine. Well, it's called a mazar. It's a holy spring where people would come and pray, and usually there would be an imam who would sit there, and you would give him a little bit of money. He would read the Quran for you, and then you'd move on. So here's a tree at the Naqshband tomb that is supposed to give fertility. Other kinds of practices, which I don't want to get too bogged down in them, but I can come back to them if people are interested in some of these controversial practices. So then what we have in the Soviet era, I've already talked about these. In the Soviet era, we have, I was talking before about modernity as very much the post-colonial experience. Well, Central Asia was, as I said, it experienced very intense change during, not so much even the Russian Tsarist occupation, but much more so during the Soviet experience. There was a lot of change to the economic practices, changing various agricultural practices, industrialization. The establishment of nation states was very critical. Before you had various autonomous regions in the Soviet era. Before that, there were various kingdoms. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was an intellectual movement that tried to rally for a united Turkestan. The Bolsheviks, unfortunately, dismissed that. So then what you had were these nations that were created during Stalin's rule, actually. And that has had important implications for the spiritual life, because the institutions that guide people in their spiritual lives are very closely linked to the nation states. And then you also have the creation, kind of reification of ethnicities. Ethnicity in Central Asia it wasn't so, people had different ways of conceptualizing identity. In the Soviet era, they created a set of categories of ethnicity, and these became closely linked with spiritual identity or religious identity. And then, of course, modern forms of education, literacy, books became much more widely available. These are all part of the colonial project of the Soviet Union. Religion was very much a cause for concern by the Soviets. Of course, Marxist ideology is an atheist ideology, but religion was not banned in the Soviet era, but it was changed. It was very much changed to accord with a new kind of modern way of life. In the early 20s and 30s, you had aggressive campaigns, but much later, you had more permissive eras, particularly in the 70s and 80s. So that by the end of the Soviet era, you had a lot of people who were really interested in religion, and they had, because of the way that ethnicity had been linked to religious identity, they had a clear sense of themselves as being, if they were Kyrgyz or Kazakh or Tajik, of being Muslim, or if they were Russian, or one of these, or another Slavic ethnicity, of being Orthodox Christian. This was a very central part of their identity. But a lot of the rest of the things that go with that have been kind of lost, like the actual practices that you might do, or the actual beliefs that you might have associated with that. So these are some of the other ways that the Soviets had a large impact on the construction of religion. Now, this is where this notion of multiple modernities comes in. One of the things that I think Talal Assad points out is that it's problematic to always understand modernity as whatever it is that the West has idealized it as. That actually, when you look at something like the Soviet regime, it had its own understanding of modernity, which had some overlap with the West, but in other ways was quite different. So one of the things that the Soviets really, they wanted to take control over all of the religious institutions. They set up religious boards and basically allied with the scholars who were part of those religious boards and helped and basically legitimized whatever the scholars in those particular religious boards said. They got rid of the Sufi orders, and these domestic practices, urf adat, became also a very important site of religious practice, but hidden in the domestic realm where women were particularly keeping them alive. So what you had was kind of a polarization. Over here in the official religious boards that the Soviet state was allied with, you had notions of religious authority that was very narrow. You follow this one person, says the state, and you do what he says, and that's the end of the story. And everybody has to go to these particular mosques, and this particular sermon has to be read. In the private domain, however, this is where this differentiation comes in. In the private domain, people were doing all kinds of things and calling them Islam. They were doing all kinds of things and calling them spiritual practice, and believing all kinds of things and calling them legitimate beliefs. So you have kind of a polarization that was part of this modern Soviet project of controlling, of coming in as a state power, setting up state institutions, putting religion into its own particular institution and controlling that too, really lifting the state to having a much more powerful role in this region. One of the things that happened was what Dale Eichelman and James Piscatori have called is the objectification of religion. Religion has become so closely tied with identity that it's really kind of, for many people, just an identity marker and doesn't have much substance. So that has been one thing that people have been interested in the more recent study of Soviet religion or post-Soviet experiences. So now that we've come to the modern era, I don't want to say too much more, but just to introduce what is going on there. This is my field site now. Since independence, the Kyrgyz Republic has emerged as, let's say, one of the freest nations, but at the expense of the financial stability of people and the political stability. It is quite unstable. But it's actually, when you look at the experiences of spiritual traditions across the Central Asian republics, a lot of them have a lot less freedom because of the nature of the state. But Kyrgyzstan also has a particularly, it's trying to be authoritarian, and the state controls a lot of religious life, but not quite to the degree in some of the other republics. So what do we see in independent Kyrgyzstan? We see the revitalization of interest in spirituality. And this is partly because of those processes of creating ethnic identities, putting everybody into the ethnic identity categories, and then tying those ethnic identities to particular religions so that it was part of your identity to also have a religion. And then, of course, after independence, when people became interested in religion again, they knew that they had a religion. They just didn't know anything about it. So that's been, revitalization has been really critical and it's been seen a lot. So you see a lot of building of mosques all over. You see it much more, you see religious announcements all over the city. People put really interesting signs up reminding people to practice. You see the competition from other faiths. So even though people have a sense, many Kyrgyz people at least, or Uzbeks who I work with, have a sense of themselves as being Muslim and their ancestors as being Muslim, there are other faiths that are increasingly becoming attractive to them. You have continued state surveillance of religion in all different ways, continuing the Soviet practice of having an institution that controls all the messages. That's the one source of authority, of religious authority. At the same time, you also have a state agency that basically is the state's way to watch everybody and make sure that people are obeying the laws. This is the Kyrgyz Mufti. This is their Facebook page. And then you have a proliferation of media that are available. Videos and books coming from all over the world, translated into local languages, a certain number of local experts, so that anybody who can go to the bazaar and has a little bit of money in their pocket can actually buy these, work by these authorities and be their neighborhood authority. So a lot of mass production of books, mass production of media has really shaped the way people think about their faith. Scripture has really changed because of the increase of literacy and the availability of mass media. People are more focused now on what Scripture says, rather than, oh, here's a little piece of Scripture, let me put it in my amulet and wear it on my neck, and that's going to help me. Now people are interested in, well, what does it actually say? And this is where rationalization comes in. People want to know what Scripture says, what they need to do, why they need to do things like that. This is part of kind of a, let's say, a modernization of the ways that people think about their faith. Connections to global Islam. So you have a lot of investors from all over the world coming in and bringing, this is the local shopping mall, and they were passing out these wonderful times for Orozo, or Ramadan, as we know it here. So to bring this full circle then, rationalization, we've seen how modernity, in the sense of a post-colonial era, increased differentiation in this ethnographic context, increased contact with the whole world, not just limited to their borders. And we see how all of these things are changing the ways people are thinking about their faith. They're asking questions now. They're demanding more they're demanding more depth in terms of the way that they understand their theologies. We do see a certain amount of secularization in terms of the way that the state has come in and taken control and pushed religion out of many of the spheres that it used to be in. And finally, multiple modernities. We see that for many Kyrgyz people, a lot of ethnographic work reveals that many people in the region are nostalgic for the modernity that was the Soviet modernity, for a era when, yes, there was state surveillance and they couldn't practice religion openly, and for many of them, it's wonderful to be able to practice openly, but at the same time, they reject the Western ideals of consumerism that have become essentially, for them, for many people in Kyrgyzstan, to define what Western modernity is. So they're really trying to find other ways to understand and experience and be part of modernity. So I think I will stop there and take some questions. I realize I haven't actually said much about my own ethnographic work, but I'm happy to take some questions about that or anything else. Questions?
This is really not a question. No, take that away. I think I speak loud enough.
Sure.
I feel that you've presented me with a beautiful skeleton, and I have no meat. It was very abstract, and this could have been out of anything. I feel as a Muslim, I really didn't learn anything.
Oh.
That it's not a criticism of a very interesting lecture, but I came here with an expectation of having some more flesh, some more color, rather than a system into which I then put my own stuff.
So what you're saying is you'd rather have more human stories, kind of the ethnographic side?
I just would like to know in what, I would like to have had some examples.
Yes.
Like, because the Soviets did this, now when they did do 5 prayers, now they do 4. This is an invention.
Right.
But you know, something concrete.
Yes. Okay, where can I start? Well, I was hoping that I would have time to illustrate some of these shifts, some of these ways of thinking about modernity in terms of some of my own ethnographic fieldwork. One of the things that has been very interesting then, let's see, one of the ways that maybe more modern ways of modernized ways of thinking emerged were experiences of intergenerational conversations about what spiritual authority is and what practice is and why one should practice. So one of my closest friends had become very devout and very interested in her faith, reading a lot of books about it. And she was critical of her mother, who practiced who did a number of rituals that she believed were shirk, which is the Kyrgyz word for idolatry, essentially.
Right.
And so there was one particular practice where, when it was a new moon, you would go out and you would salute the moon. Now, her mother is a very, I consider her a very devout person in her own way, but she was raised during the Soviet era of, for many people, religion couldn't really be practiced in the public sphere, and you really didn't have access to religious knowledge at all. All you had was what your mother and your grandfather talked about. And so when this young girl told to her, "You're doing this wrong, you can't do this, this is incorrect," she was very determined, even though this young girl had clearly read a lot and she had rational reasons for it and theological reasons for it, there was kind of a clash of mentalities there in the sense that she wasn't willing to recognize the authority of her daughter. She was more thinking about the authority that the kind of the localized authority of what her elders had done, the way that they had constructed their spiritual tradition, particularly in the domestic contexts. And so there was a certain amount of friction between these two for a long time. One of them becoming much more devout, much more interested in book knowledge, learning about a practice, doing everything possible to practice in a correct way and learn what the correct way was. And the mother, who was I'm going to do what my ancestors are doing. She also, there was this, I mean, going back to this issue of scripture as a powerful object versus as a source of knowledge. The mother would talk to me about how when she was growing up in the village, everybody was afraid of the Quran. You could not touch it. Only the imam could touch it. It was so powerful and so almost something that you'd be afraid of. Whereas her daughter, which is a very different way of thinking about the holy, the divine, and whereas her daughter was much more interested in, well, what is this book and what does it actually say? And how can I use what it says to think about my salvation, to think about my, how I conduct my everyday life, how I conduct my relationship with my mother, who I don't agree with about all of these kinds of things. So that's where I can start to bring it into the ethnographic context. Yes.
I just have a question. I want to thank you again for a very well organized presentation, and after a 3-hour drive, very lively. So so you brought a lot of energy to this, which I appreciate. To what extent has the Central Asian rediscovery, let's say, of Islam or reclamation of Islam, to what extent has this been affected or tampered with by proselytizing Muslims from another part of the Muslim world who want to promote a particular kind of Islam, which is very much a response to the Western hegemonic ideas of development and modernity? So to what extent has the Central Asian experience been colored? Even this generational story that you just shared with us sounds to me as if it shows signs of, let's say, some kind of external tampering or external ideas about the correct Islam in a very monolithic sort of way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that there are diverse voices. There are diverse sources of authority. So immediately at independence, there was a rush by Saudi Arabia to send materials, to send Qurans, to send books, translated books. So there was a certain amount of that kind of activity. There were the Turkish schools that were opened, who also have brought a lot of learning, and this particular young woman that I was talking about, she actually studied at a Turkish school and was very deeply moved by the faith of her resident advisors. And that's why she decided she was going to not be like her parents, but actually become more pious and observant. There have been a certain number of South Asian Tabligh Jamiats have come in. They actually have not been received very well. Central Asians found them off-putting because of the ways that they dressed. And
yeah, I'm not sure where they're well received, actually. But,
okay. And then of course there's a lot of political Islamic groups. And this is where I think the American media, judging from my students, the American media gets a lot of these stories wrong, because for a lot of people, particularly not so much in Kyrgyzstan, but particularly places like Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, where the authoritarian government is so overwhelming and so it doesn't let people practice anything in terms of religion except a very narrow, the official mosque. Anything else is very quickly the product of suspicion. But so that has actually kind of ironically empowered groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is incredibly powerful or popular in Central Asia, and for reasons that I very much understand, because they are proposing a political order that is the antithesis of what Central Asians are experiencing. All the bad things that Central Asians experience in terms of their political order. Hizb ut-Tahrir comes and says, no, we can do something different. So, all of these groups do have an appeal, and so when I talk about the authority being somewhat narrowed, I'm really talking about the way that the state has taken over the official institutions. It's taken control of mosques and imams and what is the sermon going to be on Friday, but at the same time, there's a lot of things going on underneath, underground. Women. A lot of my fieldwork has been among the women, and they are much less affected by the official narratives. So I find that in Central Asia there's a lot of blurring of politics and religion. It does make, sometimes it makes it think a lot of the religious leaders are also said by the government to be essentially political, problematic political figures. But women don't have to worry about that so much. So you find in women's circles incredible vibrancy and learning. One of the impacts of the Soviet era was people really lost touch with the outside Islamic world. They felt very much like they knew nothing. They felt deep insecurity. And so that's actually made it a very welcoming place. Yes?
So I had a comment and a question. First, as I heard you answering your first question, I was thinking of Laura Deeb's book, The Enchanted Modern, where she talks about the idea of authenticated Islam, building on Talal Asad's notion of a discursive tradition, where she's studying the community, the Shiite community in Lebanon, and the same discussion happens between there's this generational friction that happens where one generation looks at the previous one and feels that their practices are not rooted in some authentic form of religion, and that they have now found a more authentic voice. And so this notion of an authenticated Islam that Laura Deeb brings up, building on Talal Asad, but it reminded me exactly of that point that you were talking about earlier. My question was more hoping that you would expand actually on this slide, which you gave us this excellent build-up, and I felt like we didn't get the slam dunk right at the end. And what I specifically was looking for was if you could comment about rationalities and cultures of the self, because you spoke about institutional differentiation, you talked about secularization, but I was hoping that you could speak a little bit about those two aspects from this one particular slide.
Okay, so again, with rationalities, maybe I'll illustrate it again with an ethnographic example. This young woman, I will give her a name. I will call her Gulaim, this young woman that I've been talking about. Next to the house where Gulaim and I lived and her family, there was another house, happened to be a different ethnic group, and a very pious, very devout woman lived there, and she was basically viewed on the neighborhood as being the most knowledgeable about Islam, and she was actually from an ethnic group that is known to be more knowledgeable. And her daughter was very observant in the sense of whenever she would go into town, she would cover herself very carefully. Now, Gulaim was telling me one day, well, you know what, I know that her mother's really devout and she's pretty devout and she covers whenever she goes into town, but on our street, she comes out onto the street and she doesn't cover. And so to Gulaim, I don't have any position on the neighbor, but for Gulaim, this was very important. It suggested to her that the young girl, her neighbor, didn't really understand the purpose. Maybe the girl covered when her mother told her to cover. And her mother told her to cover when she went to the downtown. Her mother maybe wasn't paying attention when she just went onto the street. And so Gulaim felt that when you're going to practice something, you should understand why. And so she was always telling me, she would say, okay, well, this is what we do. She was teaching me, when she would teach me how to pray, she was like, well, now you're going to do this because this is why. And you're going to do that because this is something else. It has an impact on your soul. It has an impact on your heart. She was always trying to understand the meanings underneath what she was doing. So that it wasn't just about blind obedience or blind practice, which for the older generations, like her mother, I call her Salamanteje, among the older generations, you hit 40, 50 years old, and you start praying. And that's it, and you pray. For Gulaim, she wanted to pray and she wanted to know why. She wanted to feel something inside. So now we get to the culture of the self. She was really interested to explore what spirituality could, how it made her feel. It made her feel peace. It wasn't just something she did because everybody in the community did. And she criticized that element in her mother and the elder generations. Habit. Urb adat comes from the Arabic word for habit, I believe. This notion that these customary practices have been passed on generation to generation out of habit. And nobody really knows where they come from or if they are in the scripture or not or what have you. So this shift of trying to understand the reasoning behind things, and particularly the impact that they have on your individual soul and your development as a moral human being, too. So I'll stop there. Question here, Kevin? Thanks.
What is the present state or condition of Islamic revolutionary thought within Central Asia, and that now, with the fall of the Soviet Union, or is it still ultimately subjected to the Soviet domination, even that type of
Revolutionary thought?
Right.
I'm
In
not
other
familiar
words,
with
when
that.
I say revolutionary thought, I mean the bringing back Islam as the central force within that region.
Bringing it back to... Well, I think that the authoritarian government, the political order is such in Central Asia that that's going to be very difficult. Yes, you have underground groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir who have an agenda that's similar to that, but they are so oppressively persecuted that it's very difficult for them to really have an impact beyond certain very limited geographical regions. You know, you have certain geographical regions where everybody is a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, or at least that's the conventional wisdom. But beyond that, it's very, and particularly because of the way, I mean, one of Hizb ut-Tahrir's methodologies is to try to get military leaders on board. You know, you can't necessarily overthrow violently the president, but you try to get the military sympathetic to you, and then have them get rid of the president. But the way that somebody like Islam Karimov, president of Uzbekistan, does things, he's got, the military are all over takes people from one region, sends them to another region. There's no opportunity for any kind of unification. And the oppression is so intense that I don't see that happening. Now in Kyrgyzstan, there are a lot of people in the government who do have more of a religious perspective. There's been even efforts to legalize polygyny. There's been a number of efforts to make it easier to practice religion in the public sphere, and actually to make it harder for some of these competing faiths to come in, which is in a way simply, you know, the people in these regions don't necessarily like all these converting faiths like evangelical Christians coming in, but so you do have a certain number of political leaders in that country who like religion, but it's a very limited. So I don't see a revolution happening or any kind of really huge change. Mm-hmm.
Just based upon that experience and also the reference that you made in terms of the intergenerational tension.
Yeah.
Just anecdotally, what am I looking at soothsaying this, how might you 10 years from now, 15 years from now, based on at the micro level, interfamily, small communities, tribalistic levels, what do you foresee in that region?
In the region where I did my fieldwork.
Exactly. And what lessons might be learned that you can see that might be extrapolated to other similar situations in other parts of the developing world?
Oh. Well, one of the things that I've tried to write about is the role that spiritual and religious organizations can play in social welfare. So you do see a certain amount of religious, especially women, getting involved in the NGO sector. And I think that's the kind of grassroots thing that could have an impact and be a real positive force. I do think that people are, I think there's going to be a lot of polarization, because you do have a significant population that's very secular, and secular in the sense of, in the original sense of having nothing to do with religion. Urban people who had been part of the Communist Party, a lot of these people continue to be very disinterested. And then another segment of the population is extremely interested in everything about religion, because religion is something that can help them solve their problems. So, yeah, I think polarization.
This is the last question.
Actually, I'm from Central Asia, and
Wonderful.
I've lived in Montreal for several years. I also want to speak stuff. So what I have heard today is very familiar to me. But I wondered, why did you choose information for your research? What was the reason?
Serendipity.
It's long, very long way
Yes.
from here. So
Yes.
why was that?
Well, I was sent there as a Peace Corps volunteer, so it was kind of a fate, and then fell in love with it and became very concerned about the development industry, if I may, and its impact on the region. And I know that it's done a lot of wonderful things too, but I wanted to go back and try to understand from the outside, no longer as a development professional, from the outside, what the impact was. What is American hegemony? What is America's impact on the world in all these places where it's really determined to shape the ideologies that are important in a society? And when I was doing my research, it really kept directing me back to religious questions, because a lot of the development work, interestingly, is being done by religious groups. A lot of the Christian missionary groups are in there doing development work, and a lot of and same with a lot of the international Islamic organizations. They are investing in businesses, in education. So a lot of the development work is being done by people with spiritual backgrounds.
But outsiders.
Yes, but outsiders, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Noor. Let's give her a round. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Marcia Hermanson, board member, to present to you a token of our appreciation. Thank you all for coming.